Welcome to the Movement Brain Podcast, where we discuss the possibilities of movement through a neural lens. The Movement Brain Podcast is hosted by the Nerve Guys, Gareth Kelly and James McCambridge.
Well, hello again, and this is the second episode in the Movement Brain Podcast with Gareth and James from Moved Before. This is us. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. And basically, this episode we're looking at how and why the brain is designed for movement. So it's going to go back evolutionarily.
I can't say that word.
Evolutionarily. Why? That's $1 to me. And then we're also going to look at how other systems might affect your movement, and the same thing like how the environment affects your movement, how lots of things can affect your movement, basically, and look at how vital it is to sort of absolutely everything that you do.
Yeah, I think it's really important to think, again, if we're taking it at the level of the brain, then the brain has evolved with the body, and therefore it's made some things more important than other things. And as we go on through things, if you just take the body from the mechanical approach that like most people do, sometimes you end up getting answers that are completely the opposite from what the brain might want. So some things like core stability that we'll talk about later on, while they come from places of good intentions, actually can have huge problems if we think about what they evolved to do together.
That's it. I kind of a key thing people seem to not forget but kind of overlook a little bit is it's quite obvious when you look at the brain and how things work in the brain that it's evolved. It isn't like an IKEA thing where it's come out and everything's the way it should be, it's meant to be. It's evolved. Something that's worked well for a certain point in time has had to evolve into the next. That's why it can get a little bit messy and a little bit roundabout as well. So people sometimes then, if you're looking at something mechanically, so just from the body's point of view, actually you could be missing a trick. You could be missing quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think one of my favorite examples is just of how not everything in terms of movement in the body is next to each other. We'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about the kind of movement homunculi. Homunculi. There's a plural to it, I don't know.
I think it's homunculi.
Homunculi?
There's a Scottish author and he did a book, it was a pretty good comedic book, Brookmire.
Yeah.
Brookmire did it, and it's about they bred homunculi to become mercenaries.
Ah.
It's really, really good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
If anyone's read it, it's worth reading. It's very good. They blow up a cow.
Yeah, with in the homunculus, the eyes and the hands are actually right next to each other. So rather than everything being anatomically where they should be, eyes and hands are next to each other. And anyone who saw last time, I think we talked about the things that are next to each other affecting each other. So actually using your hands and using your eyes can quite strongly affect each other, even though it wouldn't appear to be obvious.
Exactly. They're kind of, from the brain's point of view, designed to go together.
Yeah.
So, but before we get into that, we'll start from the start. So what came first? So basically, in my notes here, I've got eating.
Eating, yeah. So we were kind of looking back at sort of how we got here and what was the difference between having a nervous system and not having a nervous system. And pretty much the answer is movement. When we look at the brain nowadays in kind of neuroscience courses and textbooks and stuff, people always say there's two main functions to the brain, and it is movement and survival. And when we take the word survival, I always kind of just say, well, no shit.
Yeah, obviously.
There's very few kamikaze organisms that I know of. I know Dr. Eric Cobb of Z Health sometimes says, actually, it's important to remember that we're built for survival because that's why none of our reflexes look cool.
They really don't, do they? Though?
It's all startle and but they're built for function rather than for performance or flashiness. And I guess that's why we've got the name Move to Perform, is that we're trying to build performance out of the function. It doesn't just come naturally.
That's it.
But yeah, so for me, the more interesting one is movement. There's an interesting TED talk called The Real Reason for Brains, and it's by a guy, I might be wrong on this, it's been a while since I watched it. I feel like his name is Daniel Walpert. It might not be, that might be somebody else entirely, and I'm getting it mixed up.
If it is a random other person, and not this Daniel that you speak of, we'll put the correct link down.
Yeah, we'll add a correction.
Anyway.
But yeah, he has a TED talk, somebody has a TED talk, possibly Daniel, possibly somebody else, has a TED talk called The Real Reason for Brains, and he goes through a whole 20 minutes of how the brain is built for movement. And while I don't want to go into it too much, he has his first example is that of an organism called a sea squirt who moves around, and then once it finds a rock to sit on for the rest of its life, it eats and it basically consumes its own brain and nervous system because it doesn't have any more need for it. And that pretty much happened throughout evolution. It was organisms were getting their energy through light, and then at some point it made sense that those organisms then contained enough energy to be consumed themselves. And if you wanted to do that and make use of it, though, kind of made sense that you were able to move and that you were able to travel to go get one and the other.
Because there's a lot more chance involved if you're just sort of bobbing about waiting for things to bump into you that you can eat.
Yeah, those guys aren't going to survive for very long, but the ones that are able to actively target their lunch are going to be able to do that. So out of movement, a couple of things will evolve first. So light sensitivity will probably be a really useful thing to have, specifically because what you're eating is going to be stuff that feeds off light. So the kind of old hunting adage of you go where if you want to find your food, you go where your food eats its food. So you'll go around water or grassland or whatever it is that you're trying to find. But
fried chicken on Friday night. No, sorry, continue. Oh.
Yeah, exactly. So movement became the thing, and all of these mechanisms basically just became the who's got the better movement skills to find the bigger lunch. So we start being able to move better and move better and move better, and that kind of goes on and on and on until we get to
levels of complication.
Yeah, till we get to kind of present day humans, where, or even in other mammals, let's say, where for up to that point, most of the time we're thinking about movement. Now we start to be able to think about other things as well. So there's a number of tests that people use to see whether animals have consciousness, which means we think that they can think about themselves, and things that might not necessarily equal movement or might not necessarily mean movement. Some of those are, they'll get the animal to look at itself in the mirror and they'll put a little mark on their forehead, and if they're able to, if it looks like they notice the mark, if it looks like they're affected by it, then that means they probably realize that that's them, and they'll actively try and do something about it. And in humans, obviously, then it's even more complicated. We can talk, we have language, we have the best system available of communicating with other people. So when we get to these kind of levels, the other thing humans can do as well is imagine things that don't even exist. So you can draw pictures of stuff that was never real and things like that. People might then start to argue, well, actually, that's not really movement anymore. Like you can talk to people, you could spend your whole day daydreaming. You can wake up and actually have a really interesting day where you didn't get out of bed. You just thought of things that might happen, things that could happen, imagine things that definitely won't happen because they're not real. But actually, all of those things still require movement to exist.
And those kind of thoughts can also cause physiological changes. Do you ever have a big test coming up and you get really nervous and it makes you feel physically sick? So thoughts have weight with them.
Yeah, those thoughts can have physical changes in your body. The language one is, I guess, where that starts. And actually, if we think about language, well, we have to think first about talking. Talking is a movement. You're controlling your throat and you're moving your jaw and your lips and your face. And actually, earlier language of that is body language, which is all based around physical movements. But then let's also think about why languages exist in the first place. It's not very useful if the thing that you're talking to isn't also able to move. So we didn't invent language to start talking to trees and rocks. We invented to start talking to other people, and other animals can sometimes understand language, and we can give basic commands and things, but in terms of its usefulness, it's only useful because all the other things can move. And then when we think of all of that higher order thinking, most of us would imagine we do this from like that inner monologue. We've got that internal voice.
The driver, some people call them.
The driver.
Yeah. Sitting out the front.
Yeah, or the little angel and demon that's, why don't you have another donut? Or please don't.
Yeah, all right. No. But yeah.
So you got that internal monologue that is, means you don't have to say everything out loud to think it. You can think thoughts in your head without having to say them. And for a lot of people, they'll agree that does have language. It uses language. While you might not necessarily think every single word out in your head, you kind of tend to think in words and sentences. Well, would you be able to do that if you didn't first develop the ability to speak language out loud? And I know of a lot of books I've read about child development where they suggest that the reason small toddlers talk so much is because they haven't quite yet learned how to put it all internally. They're still practicing being able to say all the words, being able to make all the words. While they're saying it, then their ears are picking up what it sounds like.
Yeah, and they're practicing the understanding.
Yeah, and they practice like, well, what does this mean, and how do I relate this to anything for the other parts of my brain? How do all those things match and link up? And once they get good at that, they get good at just thinking about how that would be, and eventually the internal monologue just moves straight to their head.
Yeah.
And if you follow that kind of pattern and logic, pretty much everything that comes after that only exists because movement existed to begin with.
Yeah. So like you are, no matter what, even if you don't think it, you're always moving. You're always doing some sort of movement, because if you were watching someone speak, say, or watching body language, your eyes are moving as they're registering, so your lens is moving and everything like that. Your eyeballs are moving, if they're moving. Whenever you're listening to it, your inner ear, there's movement in there. Whenever you're listening to language, so you're always moving. And even if you're doing totally still in a dark room, can't hear anything, see anything, you're breathing. So it's, there's movement happening in your whole body at all times. I think that's something that you kind of want to get across with movement, so it's not just running, jumping, that kind of thing.
It could be really slight, and actually that breathing example is, breathing's one of those things that we can do consciously, but actually even if we stop doing it, like for example when we're asleep, our brain, the bit that sort of sits right at the bottom of the brain, the brainstem, controls things like breathing, but also heart rate. So we've got a heart that's pumping all the time, and we have an entire nervous system that actually its whole job is to make changes that change the sort of movement of blood flow around our body, so they can expand and constrict the blood vessels, and they can shift all of the blood flow from our extremities, so around our fingers and hands. You hear people when they say, I've got bad circulation, because actually their blood flow doesn't necessarily get to their hands so much, it stays more around our core, and that is our autonomic nervous system, our what some people might know as the fight or flight system, saying, hey, you know what, we think dangerous things are happening right now. We'd rather preserve all of the internal organs. We want to make sure fuel gets to the brain and everything that's important. We're not really worried about the fingers and toes right now. Yeah, and there was another point there, I almost forgot as well. So when you're watching somebody move, you need to use your eyes and you need to move your eyes for that. But at the same time, you have mirror neurons in your brain. So there's a whole load of neurons called mirror neurons, which react to movement of other people and movement of other things. That means if you're sitting across from me and you put your arm out to the side, there's a part of my brain that imagines putting my own arm out to the side, and it's the same part that is actually in charge of moving my own arm. So it exists in our motor cortex, and that will fire as a way to help me understand what that movement and motion is. It's one of the really interesting parts of the brain that I think we don't really completely understand yet. I've heard two conflicting explanations. So there's one camp that thinks it is about action understanding. So I see you move your arm, and I imagine moving my own arm so that I can help almost try and read your mind. So I go, oh, why would my arm be going like that? And if I see a coffee cup nearby, I go, it's probably because he's reaching for the coffee, and then I can extrapolate from that and I go, Gareth is thirsty, or I've said something stupid and Gareth's about to throw hot coffee over me.
I don't have any coffee left.
Yeah, I'm glad. It's going to make what I have to say much easier. Or on the other hand, there's people that say it's not about being able to understand the action, it's just about knowing that something else is happening in the world. And I think they've proved that mirror neurons fire even when people look at things like clouds. So there's no mind reading to be going on there. It's just the cloud is moving, and there's a part of our brain that registers movement in a similar way no matter what it is.
Yeah, it's basically, you're built to move and to register movement, because once you can move, you sort of already then understand that other things can move, like as you say, clouds or a dog or something, and that all goes back to survival again. It all comes back and around, because if you saw, like, I don't know, a coyote, and if you didn't understand that could move, you're not going to take the steps to make sure it doesn't attack you.
Yeah,
if
exactly.
That makes sense. Or clouds, if there was a big, horribly dark thunderstorm, looks like going to get struck by lightning type cloud coming, you wouldn't go, that's coming towards me, I need to go find some shelter.
Yeah, and by the same proxy, so as the brain evolved and developed, the movement came first. So there's no point in us giving all of those abilities to a plant. If the plant sees, oh, here comes a tortoise that's about to eat me, even at that slow speed of the tortoise, the plant's not able to get away. So there was no reason for that plant to develop a visual system, because that information is useless to it until it at one point has the ability to move.
Yeah.
And maybe as humans we might then forego that ability and we suddenly don't move anymore. But the point is that those systems all developed in a particular order because that was what was required. And maybe now we end up with this higher order system that's able to just think about movement rather than actually doing it itself. But it's still required that we build the whole society around that.
At least the foundation's there.
Yeah.
Because, like, as you say, initially, tongue, jaw, spine.
Yeah.
Vision, vestibular, so on. It goes in very clear sort of stages.
Yeah, so that's kind of going from, why did we end up like this to, how did we end up like this? Let's look a little bit now at the order in which we got there. If we go back, most of our evolution in terms of life was done in water. So usually we'll be thinking of things like fish, and if you sort of think, what are the main characteristics characteristics of fish that we can see. Well, we talked about earlier. We talked about sensitivity to light. You want to go where the food is, which is usually plants get their energy from light. So having some sort of eyes are going to be useful very early on. Then after that, we're thinking, what else do fish have? Well, a spine. The big long spines, that's helpful for propelling them through the water. So all of those vertebrae and bones were built to be able to move with each other to
segmented movement.
Yeah, that helped them get somewhere very, very quick if they needed to either get to their food or get away from their predators. And the other thing that they had is either a tongue. You see some sea-dwelling creatures that almost use their tongue as their main part of locomotion. They just want to be able to taste, is this food or is it not? If it's food, then I'm going to absorb it, eat it, do whatever I need to do. If it's not food, then I'll just keep traveling along with my tongue until I find something that is actually edible. And to a certain extent, you see babies do this as well.
Yeah.
Most of the time when babies get something, what does it taste like? Does it taste like food? If their tongue registers, oh, this might be good, then very likely they're going to end up putting it in their mouth. And then the other one, maybe a bit later. So we are talking a little bit about evolution, and I'm very aware that I don't think either of us know the exact order in which all of these things came, or even the suggested order that people are suggesting that they came in. But I think the important thing is just knowing which of these were more early on versus which of them came a bit later. The other two things that are interesting are the jaw, which was breaking down food into smaller bits. So if you can digest things faster, it makes it easier to get more and more energy, makes you get bigger, makes you more likely to take over the world. A similar thing happened when humans created fire and they were able to cook food. That's one big difference between humans and apes, is apes spend so much more of their time digesting food than humans do, because we figured out a way to break it down quicker. And then the other thing was a vestibular system. So fish, by vestibular, by the way, I mean the little canals in our inner ear, which tell us which way up we are, if we're moving, how fast we're moving, whether we're spinning, falling, anything like that.
Basically hooked into the relationship of gravity.
Yeah, and fish obviously aren't really in danger of falling at any point, but they still had some way of telling which way up they were, and that's going to be really useful, especially combined with the eyes. If you can tell which way up you are, then you can start to remember where things are, and you can start to go, oh yeah, there's food probably this way. If you don't know which way up you are, and all you know was there was some food to the left of you, well, in 10 seconds, suddenly that to your left could be to your right, and you aren't able to tell. So those systems all kind of evolved physically a very long time ago, and were present through most other animals then that you see still have some form of a jaw, some form of a tongue, some form of visual system, some sort of balance system, and a spine. In fact, yeah, we call everything that comes out of land that comes on start that again. Everything that came onto land that isn't an insect is a vertebrate. So we go vertebrates, invertebrates. The stuff with the spines tend to be the bigger organisms because they're able to do more movement, which means accessing more food and getting away from more predators.
Yeah, again, it's all about options. You know, it's taking that, as we talked about last time, the sort of the circuit path. So it's that didn't work, this works, this works, this works, this works, and it's evolving from there along those stages. So you have there's many more options, and all the successful choices start going that way. Because, as we'll say, modern day life, everybody's trying to keep their core neutral, their spine neutral when they train or do anything, whereas in actual fact, you're built to move from a spine that moves. So we're actually almost sort of doing ourselves a disservice We're kind of locking down how we move, and in actual fact, we should have a lot more variety of movement.
Yeah, it's interesting when that's one of the quite annoying things is when people hear advice, they tend to hear what the advice is rather than why the advice is given.
Yeah.
And this core stability has been a big thing, but a lot of the time that comes from weightlifters, and weightlifters, well, if you've got a really heavy thing above your head, it probably makes sense that you don't want to have very much perturbation in your body, so you're going to want to keep your spine relatively still at that point, because any small amount of movement is going to be a huge deviation.
I think that's key there, at that point.
Yeah.
Because you'll see some weightlifters doing the likes of Jefferson curls who have got hugely flexible spines.
Yeah.
And they're super strong.
Because it doesn't mean the spine isn't supposed to move at all. So you sort of, but people look at that and go, stable spine, everybody needs that. Let's just put this into, we're all going to do core workouts and just make sure that everything never moves. But actually that's probably a very terrible idea. Your spine is designed to move. You want it to be as mobile as possible. And then once it is as mobile as possible, you want it to be able to do all the things you want it to do. So if you're a weightlifter, then you want it to be able to, you want to use that mobility to align every bit of it as perfectly as you possibly can to build the straightest stack. Or if you're a fighter, you want to be able to use that to dodge and weave.
You want to be strong in every single position your spine is able to move in.
Yeah, and so looking back at the evolution, that makes a lot of sense. Like the fish have it, they're able to move around quite a lot, and at some point your brain has evolved, your nervous system and your brain evolved to go, hey, you got a spine, it moves around, I'm going to bear that in mind as every new piece of information comes in. So whether now I've got a jaw, well, I'm going to think of my jaw as an extension of my spine. Well, now I've got arms and legs. Well, the more my spine can move, the more control I'm going to give you over your arms and legs as well, because the spine came first. So the more information the spine gives me, the more comfortable I'm going to be feeling about letting you move everything that extends from it.
Yeah, and the thing about, we say having a spine that moves is really, really important. What happens when you don't move joints?
Well, if we're talking like a long time, and this is pretty rare to see.
This is just sort of because it gives the idea of, is it good for them or not?
Yeah.
So obviously, if you do it for a day or two, it's not going to have any effect. But we're just talking, if you left it there, like, have you ever seen that experiment where they put the McDonald's burger in a box and left it?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. So if you the reason we have joints in the first place, if you think, again, evolution-wise, why would your body bother to create a gap in the bone in a certain place? And the answer is it's supposed to be able to move. And if you take any joints that don't move, if two joints move together in unison for a long enough period of time and they never move contrary to one another, then your brain's going to decide this is too much effort. There's a lot of muscle there that is supposed to stabilize at every point, So when you're when you compress down, when you put force into it, those joints have muscles working either side, firing all the time to try and make sure that they stay exactly aligned.
And all the joints are feeding information back to the brain.
Yeah.
Proprioceptive information constantly as well.
Yeah, and so if the brain's not getting that proprioceptive information because nothing's happening, and that kind of is how the brain works, if nothing's happening, the brain gets no information, it's much more energy efficient for the brain to say, how about let's just build more bone there, we'll fuse those two bones together, turn them into one bone, and then we'll let the muscles around it just waste away, because there's no point in maintaining these muscles that need energy all the time. We could just replace that with bone that will just keep everything as solid and sturdy as we already had it, and it's just as easy, it's easier to maintain. So joints that don't move for long enough will just fuse together, and by proxy, you could then assume anything you're not moving for a long enough period of time is going to become very, very stiff. So if we're thinking about core stability and holding everything rigidly all the time, which I'm sure not that many people do, but it was always the kind of feeling I got that people were trying to say about it, then you can imagine, yes, stiffness is going to be the byproduct of that.
Yeah, it's just the impossible goal of the neutral spine. I blame the 80s.
Yeah.
So I do, really. It's 80s action films and everyone trying to get as big as they possibly can. They look like these 80s action movie heroes, and they're all, they're doing their squats and deadlifts and everything, but it's all, everyone's got the goal of the neutral spine, do your deadlifts with the neutral spine, do your squats with the neutral spine. And obviously it's to avoid injury, but if your spine's strong enough, you should be able, to do your squats and deadlifts with a natural spine, because there's flexion. Your natural spine is not neutral, it's not straight.
Yeah, and actually when we get into the neurology of it as well, a lot of these postural corrections that people make, we've got two movement systems in our body. We have one that is under voluntary control, and then we have one that is under autonomic control, and we don't control it. The one under voluntary control is the one where we start to feel muscles burning and we start to feel aching. So for example, if I just reach my arm out to the side and I hold it there, eventually the muscles are going to start to burn and they're going to start to ache, and they're going to start to burn because I'm voluntarily trying to hold my arm out to the side, and eventually my brain doesn't want me to do that. So the easiest way is to say, hey, guess what? This is getting tired. Maybe you should think about stopping. What I don't feel is while my arm is held out to the side, there's a whole lot of muscles working on the other side that are making sure I don't fall over in the direction of the arm that's being held out. And I don't need to notice if they're getting tired or not because I'm not in control of them anyway. So when we think of all of these adjustments that we're making in our spine, if I tried to do this entire podcast sitting up vertically as straight as I possibly can, eventually all of those little bits that I've changed are just going to start to feel tired and sore, and it's going to be much more comfortable to slump back into this nice position. But this position isn't going to get tired. It's going to just keep happening because this is the position my the automatic systems are saying, yeah, just sit in this nice slouched, comfortable position.
This allows us to do what we want to do and save as much energy as we can save.
Yeah.
We're not wasting anything. So the thing about joints as well, though, is healthy joints help spread force. So, because we're built to move over uncertain terrain, so we're built to move around the earth, basically, and that could be loads of terrain. It could be soft sand, rocks, forest, whatever. So we're built to dissipate movement, and that goes on through up into the jaw as well. And a lot of people don't realise that, so they understand that the legs dissipate movement, but what they don't realise is every joint in the body will feel every foot strike. It dissipates as it goes up. So right down into the knuckles of your hand will reverberate with each foot strike up into the jaw, but people seem to just think it's the lower limbs.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one to see when you see it change in real time. For example, if you tell somebody to walk as fast as they possibly can with no arm swing at all, something else is going to change. So that a lot of people never realize the reason why the arms are swinging, but actually it's just a way of allowing that force to travel through the body without any two joints having to jolt and take a lot of that force at once. I've seen people when they restrict their arm movement, suddenly their walk becomes like a bounce, and their legs are taking much more energy, and so they're having to do more movement, and they're having to move in a unnatural way. I don't know whether that always means everyone will go into a bounce. I'm sure there's other more side-to-side movement and more
speed's a big one.
Rotation of the spine, and maybe they might just change the walking speed. But yeah, it goes the entire way, and every single one of the joints, all of the joints that are available to move are involved. So you may find when we get people that say, oh, I've got jaw pain, well, one of the questions we ask is, all right, let's look at you walk, because maybe there's something in the chain that's glaringly obvious. Maybe you've been injured in a certain place over and over, and actually that is stopping the transfer of force there. And so much more of it is ending up in the smaller muscles in the jaw. Or similarly, if we see people walk, or we're looking at somebody's ability to stabilize their core, because as much as we just slated it, sometimes actually we want them to be able to stay still if they need to be able to. Well, maybe it's not the spine. Maybe you've worked that hard enough. But one thing that people very rarely go to in their workout plan is jaw mobility. Yeah. So we find huge results there. I've seen actually some theories in acrobats for things like somersaults, when people are having really heavy landings on the ground, and you feel in your sacrum or like in your lower back there's dull ache. Quite often that might actually be because of cervical spine mobility, so mobility in your neck or mobility in your jaw. It's just too tense there, and so all of the force has to dissipate lower down.
Yeah, a little, not a test, but a little thing to note. People don't really think about the force dissipation like hitting places like the jaw, but if you've ever went to step off a curb and you thought the ground was further away than it was, and you get that ricochet up, and you do feel it sometimes, at the base of the skull or in the jaw, things like that. That just lets you know how much force is actually travelling up through each foot strike.
Yeah.
And it's just whenever something happens out of the blue like that sometimes it just pops into people's consciousness for a second. They're like, Jesus, what the hell was that?
Yeah, and it's really interesting as well. If you ask, not always with walking, it's hard to tell, and especially because a lot of our systems that deal with walking are very automatic. But if you get somebody onto like a wooden floor, barefoot on a wooden floor, and ask them to run as quietly as they can, and you see how much of the rest of their body that they have to use, even if they're not aware that they're doing it, they will not run in the same way. And to keep the noise levels down on the floor, you'll see much more spinal rotation, much more arm swing.
A lot more playing with the force of gravity to make the impact as light as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in order to do that, you need to be able to move the rest of your body, the rest of the joints. But this isn't a movement lesson, this is a brain-based sort of chat about movement. So it isn't just your body that moves you, is it, James? It's other systems as well. So you've got your visual system, you've got your vestibular system, as well as the proprioceptive information coming in. So it's not just a body-based thing. So a lot of people, especially people that work in the health and fitness industry, they only ever treat the body. Generally, I like things like FRC, for example. As much as it's great and it is very, very useful, it's only a tiny part of the puzzle. If you look back, go back to the start of the podcast when we're talking about how early things have evolved. So that's why like vision and vestibular are actually a bigger part of movement than the proprioceptive section.
Yeah.
Because they became first. So if you have problems there, if they're not integrated well with the proprioceptive system, as many degrees of rotation in your hips and your shoulders as you want aren't probably going to solve the problem.
Yeah, and if you look at vision as an example, vision is probably the best example, because when you look at the entire brain and the neurons that make up vision, it ends up accounting for 50% of the whole brain. So that's not to say that 50% of the neurons are being able to build a picture. Even in the occipital lobe, if I'm correct on this, I think it is about 1/6 of the neurons in the occipital lobe are actually taking the light that comes in to your eyes, and then the other 5/6 are deciding how that should look. So you don't actually see the world how it looks exactly based on the light that has entered your eyes. We've decided, for example, faces are the best example. We've got software in the brain that decides whether something is or isn't a face. And we go a bit nuts on that. I think you're about to bring it up. When you see like the light switch that looks like it's got a big nose and, and a little smiley.
Got octopuses everywhere. Coat hangers.
Yeah. We that can go a bit overboard. Sometimes we start seeing faces and things because we know anything that has a face might be able to move. So is it going to be food? Is it going to be a threat? Is it going to do something unexpected? It becomes a really useful survival tool. So, and again, with the brain built for survival, it's better to assume something that looks like a face is a face until you can be sure that it's not, rather than assume the other way around, because you will survive much longer by playing safe than by taking risks.
Yeah.
People always look at the movement output of what's happening, but we don't realize that actually, again, as far as our brains developed, it's decided anything that came first is more important. So the visual system is going to be more important than the systems coming after that decide how to move. And that kind of makes sense. If you don't know, why would you move if you didn't know what you were moving towards?
Yeah.
Or, maybe there were organisms that just sort of randomly moved around and eventually found food, but the ones who were able to target themselves specifically were going to have a better time. So the brain would put more energy into seeing things and finding things, and then the movement is the secondary purpose. Same for the vestibular system. Once we got out of water and onto land, anything that falls over and smacks its head off a rock or the ground is wiped out almost immediately. It doesn't work anymore. So you need a system that's very strong, that's going to keep you upright, and then you need to then you want to do the movement afterwards. I kind of think like the FRC example is a little bit like if you're in a sensory deprivation tank and you're allowed all the movement you want. Well, what would you do?
Yeah.
Probably just lie there. You can't hear anything, you can't see anything.
Don't know which way is up, you just float about doing nothing.
Yeah. And actually the sensory deprivation is probably a good example of how important vision is again, because when you go into those things and you can't see anything, a lot of people report hallucinating, and that's just the brain's way of going, oh crap, I don't see anything.
We need to see something.
Yeah, I need to be able to see something. I don't survive unless I can see what's going on. I'm going to imagine my best guess based on all the memories that you have. I'll imagine my best guess of what you should be seeing.
That's it.
Which is horribly wrong, but yeah.
And not to slate things like FRC and stuff, it's great, but it is just a small piece of the whole bigger picture. Like if you go into a room and you're able to see and the lights are on and it's nice and bright, you're able to move. Okay, and you've got all your range of motion. But if you turn out the lights and it's pitch dark, you'll instantly find it hard to move, no matter how many degrees of range you've got in your shoulders or your hips. Because you can't see, you're going to still find it hard to move.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of, I like to keep that sort of that in mind for everyone, just that there are other systems that are more important in relation to movement.
Yeah, and even other systems like smell, I think, also Andrew Huberman talked recently about experiments where if you put a pleasant versus an unpleasant smell in the room, and people's automatic movement systems will move them away from the unpleasant smells and towards the pleasant ones, even if they're not aware that they're doing it. So when they're blindfolded as a group, they see everybody collectively start moving towards, again, what might be food and away from what might not be. And as the example as well of like, we want to know what we can eat and what not, and once we can orient ourselves, then the next thing we want to do is remember where the food was. So smell ends up being really really closely connected with memory, because we need to remember what was good for us that we could eat and where it was, so we can go back and find that again. So all those things connect, and actually we don't really mind how we get there. So we can move in, you can move towards the food in any way. You can walk, crawl, run, whatever movement options you have available to you, you are free to do, but the important thing is just knowing where it is and knowing how to get there.
Yeah, and as I say, good movement will come from the range of things. It'll come from other senses, other sensory input, and other interpretation of it, and that'll generate the output of movement. Bad movement can also come from that. You might have nothing wrong with your joint snap, but suffer a bit of pain because the other system, or anxiety, or headaches, whatever, you might suffer something detrimental because the other systems aren't in tune.
Yeah, and that's actually, you can notice that is if I've hurt my arm, I don't get nearly as much anxiety as if I can't see. I had a story, I think it was at a Z Health course. One of the instructor was talking about a friend of his that played video games professionally. Now, like one of those guys, I imagine, that sits in the stadium and has the big screen, and obviously what's going to be really useful in that scenario is you don't want to be able to see all the fans. You just want to be able to see the screen, the TV, what you're doing. And I believe the story went that when his peripheral vision, his entire visual field just condensed into this little small circle in front of his face, and because he spent so much time doing what he did, that's just how his visual field was all the time. And when he stepped out into the street, actually his anxiety levels shot up because any sound that he hears, he can't just find it. His head has to look in every single different position before he knows what everything is. And when he doesn't know what everything is, that's quite threatening. Whereas on the other hand, if he tied his hands behind his back, which is the most useful part of him to be able to move, or even if you tied his legs together, he'd walk out, he'd be in discomfort, but probably not in the same level of anxiety.
Yeah.
I've had a similar thing when I'm walking through the street. For a little while, I had a problem with my left ear, possibly due to all the surgery and all the stuff I've had on the left side of my face over the years. My left ear, I would just completely lose my hearing for like sometimes months at a time, but it would just go away and come back. And I remember one time that was particularly memorable was when it happened while I was walking in the street, and it was like a busy street. It was Shoreditch in London, so there's loads of people all around. Left side of my ear just cuts out, and now I can't hear anything out of the left side, and I could feel a sense of like nothing and anxiety at the same time. It was like I wanted to be hyper aware of everything on my left side because I couldn't hear.
Yeah, you're just trying to get extra information.
Yeah, and it was really bothering. But then when I thought about my right hand side, it just felt fine. It was like anything on that side, I don't care. But I wanted to stare down every single person that was on the left side of me. I needed to know who they were or what they were, to be like, oh, is this safe? Am I going to get robbed? And I've never been robbed in London, but that was the first time my brain went, oh yeah, this is, if it's ever going to happen, it's today. Someone's coming up on the left side of you, they're going to get you, they're going to be gone.
It was me.
Yeah.
But yeah, but again, that's just another example of how movement is generated from a whole host of things. And just necessarily, if there's one thing that if anyone listening to this episode takes away, it is don't just focus on the mechanical proprioceptive, the body aspect. It could be other things that are a little bit more important towards generating movement, causing bad movement, and also improving those things, or even making those things a couple of % better, can actually, if you're not in pain or anything, increase your performance in movement as well.
Yeah, just because movement is your goal, it doesn't mean movement is the way to get there. Movement is the output of all of those things telling the brain how dangerous the world is right now. And if you're in a really dangerous world, you're not going to move the same way as if you're in a world that's really safe. Your posture will change. Anyone who's in danger reverts to that kind of closed over posture. Anyone who feels super safe stands nice and confidently, and I think that's kind of the basis of all those power poses that they used to say. If you stand with your arms really tall, you'll feel really confident, and things like that. maybe a little more complicated than that, but actually standing up tall and straightening up your spine gives you more movement options to escape. So very possible that it might help your brain go, hey, look, we're in a nice position, I can see more things. Whereas if I'm hunched over and head down to the floor, I can't see so many things coming towards me. But interestingly, even if we're thinking about the proprioceptive, oh man, I still got the hiccups today. Even if we're thinking about...
That was hours ago.
Yeah, hiccups for 7 hours so far.
That's fun, movement all day.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, go on.
Fun fact, actually, since we're talking about evolution, I believe the current thinking on hiccups is it's like a remnant of when we had gills. So that's your body trying to react as if you still had gills on the side of your neck, and it would just expel everything through there. I believe that's still the theory. It was at the time I discovered it anyway. But yeah, even if proprioception is our goal, one of the interesting things to look at is, well, how does your brain deal with proprioception? You know, we train, most training programs, when we think of them, they're like, how do you move for better shoulders, better elbows, better knees? Occasionally you'll get ankles, occasionally you'll get hips as well. But when we look at, well, what's the brain designed to do, you start to look at the motor homunculus and the sensory homunculus. So this is, if you took the ratio of what a person looks like versus what a person would look like if they were proportionally built to how the brain builds the map of itself, they're not quite the same. So actually we would just have these huge hands and a huge face and a huge mouth and nothing else. Like, the brain has so many neurons, so many neural connections that build, that go to dealing with your hand movement or a sensation on your hand than it does sensation on your wrist or your elbow. And the same with your mouth, that actually this is pretty much, as far as the brain's concerned, when it's thinking about what my hand's going to do and what's my face going to do. I'm going to need my face to communicate with other people. I'm going to need my eyes and senses to gather information. And then eventually, when I find the food I want, I'm going to want to put it in my hands, and then I'm going to want to put it in my mouth and eat it. So hands and face are the two most important, and then with a little bit on feet. Really, the maps are kind of based around how many bones there are in each section. So our hands and our feet have many more bones in them than, let's say, our elbow does. There's so many more bones, and that means more joints, more options, possibilities for movement,
more feedback.
And more feedback. Yeah. And we never really train any of those, and possibly a good reason for it. The elbow, because it doesn't have so much of a representation in the brain, it means it's more likely to feel pain. If something goes wrong, the brain isn't able to figure out what's going on because it doesn't have so much information coming in to base it off of. But also, if we want to improve our movement, actually we might want to think more about our hands, more about our face, and more about our feet. So foot mobility as a big example, most people ignore. Most of the time we're in shoes that restrict the movement of our feet. That's kind of a controversial thing at the moment, because people are saying, well, actually barefoot shoes, some studies are saying, oh, this is really the best thing ever, and then some are saying, we tried barefoot shoes while running and it caused more injuries than less injuries. So I don't really want to comment on running specifically, but just being barefoot more of the time is going to allow more movement through the joint, more movement with your foot. And that's going to feed more information to the brain in a way that the brain understands. So actually, our brain is more likely to feel safe when we're moving our hands and feet than when we're trying to tell our elbow to do something.
Yeah, that's it. I personally, if I'm not outside walking, I'm not in shoes. I will try and be out of shoes as much as humanly possible. And just to speak to the running thing, obviously I have no idea, I haven't read any of these studies at all about the barefoot shoes, but it all depends on what you're running on as well. Because, you know, as much as there is rock and solid surface, I don't think we're able to be pounding concrete in barefoot shoes. You know, but as I say, the better information your feet are given, the less movement problems you're generally probably going to have, knees, hips, and further up the chain. A lot of people that I've seen in the past with really bad knees and hips and lower spines and all that kind of thing, they've always naturally worn big, cushy trainers.
Yeah. And it's hard to know which came first, but I know for myself because I wear like the barefoot shoes all the time now. And I find it very hard. So I've had a few times when I've gone camping and stuff where those shoes are a bit more expensive. I don't want to bring them. I don't want to get them covered in mud. So I'll buy a pair of trainers. Literally within minutes of the trainers being on, my knees are working harder than massively harder than they were before.
Yeah.
And I've heard similar stories from people when they put the barefoot shoes on straight away. Suddenly it's like, oh, my ankles the next day, they're so worn out because actually, we're putting them through motions and movements that we weren't doing before.
Yeah, definitely. I would see it whenever if I have to wear like heavy boots or trainers or anything like that, if I go camping, I actually take a pair of Freys, cheap Chinese, not sponsored by the way, but cheap sort of, because a lot of acrobats would wear them anyway. Very little padding in them, very flat soled, and I just take those for camping now. But just not to get on it, this isn't a camping podcast, so we'll probably wrap it up there because they will just start talking about what shoes we use for shopping next and what shoes we use for going to the beach. But hopefully you got something from that about how important the brain is to movement and how it's the brain that generates movement in the body, not the body that generates the movement, and that other systems contribute to the overall output, and if they aren't working, that you might have some sort of movement issue that isn't solved in just a purely mechanical way. Just leave you with a simple, the Z Health, or Z Health, sorry, American.
Yeah.
The Z Health outlook on it is, if you're in the jungle and there's a tiger in the jungle with you, you want to see that tiger so that you can change direction. If you don't see it, you want to be able to feel the tiger pushing you over so you can try and get away. The last thing you want to be able to do is proprioceptively use your body to feel the tiger when it's taking a chunk out of your leg. So that just lets you know sort of, not the hierarchy, but the importance of all of these systems working together. Because let's face it, if you could see the tiger but your body won't move, you're not running away anyway. So it's all three together, but they're not equal parts in general, but they all have to work together. So I'm going to start rambling soon, so I think we should leave that one there.
Nice. Cool.
See you guys next time.
See you in the next one.